Hi friends, I hope you're all doing well. Back in June, I challenged myself to create one collage a day for the whole month. It was a great way to evolve my art practice, and some of my favorite collages came from that period. I'll be doing the same art practice for November with a few changes. Instead of working in an art journal, I cut individual pieces from this mixed media paper pad. Each one is 4.5 by 6 inches. I decided on this size because it was easy to cut 4 identical pieces from the original 9 by 12 sheets. Also, I recommend creating small collages if you want to try this practice, especially if you don't have much time each day for art. My plan is to focus on exploring different proportions, negative space, and experimenting with strong light and dark value elements. I tend to use a lot of mid-tone values in my art. So let's get started with day 1. I thought the white paper might be hard to see on camera when it's placed directly on the drop cloth, so I decided to put a small piece of brown cardboard underneath it. I brought out my leftover scraps container so I can see how many of the remaining scraps I could use up. It's a little less than half full. I want to use as many as possible before bringing out the larger papers from my stash. Also, I brought out these 2 mediums and Mod Podge to use as adhesives. There's such a small amount of Mod Podge left over that I'll probably use it up in 2 to 3 collages. And of course, scissors and a smoothing tool. For this daily practice to work for me, I need to keep the supplies out on my work table. It's easier to get started if all the supplies are out, especially if you're working within a limited time frame. If you can't do this because you work on a kitchen table or on a dresser in your bedroom like I did for many years, then I would suggest putting them in a box. This way, all your supplies are together and it's easy to get to. So let's talk about the collage I'm creating now. I started by working with dark value leaning papers. I'm trying different placements to see how they will look. I'm being mindful about proportions, large elements with small elements. Also thinking about negative space. I'm leaving some of the substrate untouched, meaning not gluing the papers to all 4 edges. I tend to do that. I typically cover the whole substrate with either paint or paper. This is a simple collage. As I mentioned when I did this daily practice back in June, I consider the first few collages as warm-ups. I compare it to warming up my hand before drawing or stretching before exercising. You probably noticed that I cut out from the video when I'm applying the adhesive. I'm removing this step to save time. Here's the finished simple collage, and here's the grayscale version. It has a decent amount of negative space. It has strong dark and light values with a minimal amount of mid-tone value, which is the mustard color element. I like the color and shape of this rust paper. I didn't want to cut too much. Since I'm working with proportions, I'm starting with the large element, then move on to the smaller ones. Also, I like the texture and color of this thin paper. It's a scrap from a larger monoprinted paper that I have in my stash. It will be the transitional element between the larger rust element and the smaller ones that will be placed above it. It's good to have contrast between the size of the elements. As I mentioned, I'm trying to work on having large and small elements with a minimal amount of mid-size ones. I like the design at this point, so I'm starting to glue down the elements. I'm peeling up the orange element because I want the mustard yellow one slightly underneath it. Fortunately, the adhesive wasn't too dry, so I was able to peel it up. I pulled this dark brown scrap because I thought the collage needed a few more dark values. Also, I like the long, narrow shape. I like how the top section of the collage has many horizontal elements. It contrasts with the large element that takes up a little over half of the lower section. I cut the dark brown scrap into two elements to balance with the existing dark brown scrap that's already glued down. I like the design of this simple collage. Here's the grayscale version. Again, a decent amount of negative space and strong light and dark values. This is the final collage for this week's video. I want to have time to edit and upload it for today, which is Sunday. It's a short week of daily collages. My plan is to have a video up on Sunday showing all the collages for the previous week. Again, starting with large elements, I like the shape of both the brown and the orange scraps, so I didn't want to alter them too much, just a slight trim. I want to include different shapes that I don't typically use in my collages or don't use too often, and these two fit that description. Since I'm on a time constraint, I decided to glue both of these elements now. I didn't overthink the placement. I'll work on placing the other elements around or on top of these two. I decided that the dark green scrap was too dark. It would blend into the brown element. This mid-tone blue adds just enough contrast. I'm leaving it unglued for now. I had the idea to add very small scraps below the brown element. I may want to glue the blue scrap slightly on top of one or two of the very small scraps. These scraps will be a mix of squares and rectangles, not perfectly cut. I like uneven shapes, but I do want the bottom edge to be somewhat level. I love the patina of old book pages. I've mentioned this before in previous videos. When I use ephemera with text, I like to place it either upside down or sideways, so it isn't easy for the viewer to read. I want it to be seen as an element, not reading material. Now that the very small elements are glued in place, I'm deciding on the placement of the blue scrap before gluing it down. Then this collage is finished. I like the design of this simple collage as well. Here's the grayscale version. It has a larger amount of negative space. Also, it's evenly balanced with light, mid, and dark value elements, which isn't necessarily part of my initial plan, but it is a good design, so I'm happy with it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have any questions. I hope to see you next week for a new set of daily collages. Take care.